Good afternoon, everyone. It's our privilege to host Dr. Sophie Haines as a visiting fellow at the Institute, and my privilege to introduce her to all of you. Sophie is here from the University of Edinburgh, where she lectures in the anthropology of development. Her contributions to the critical social science of water resonate particularly strongly with social science projects that are housed here at MUSSI, but her work more broadly explores knowledge practices, environmental perceptions, and decision-making in the context of social and ecological change. Before she took up her position at Edinburgh, she worked for several years as a research fellow at the Institute for Science, Innovation and Society at Oxford University. This often entailed reaching beyond anthropology and other social sciences to work in transdisciplinary partnerships with natural scientists and policymakers. She's a member of the Royal Anthropological Institute's Environment Committee and the convener of the Network for Anthropologies of Forecasting Weather and Climate. And her talk today is titled, as you can see, Labor, Love and Logistics in Rural Belize. Watershed, Citizenship, Labor, Love and Logistics in Rural Belize. So you're very welcome to MUSSI, Sophie, and I'll turn things over to you.
Thank you so much, Elena, for the introduction and for hosting me here and making this happen. Also to Rob and to Linda, to everyone in the MUSSI team. This visit has been a couple of years in the making, so I'm very happy to be able to be here finally. Also thanks to Steve Coleman and to the Anthropology Department for co-hosting this talk. And to everyone who's attending, whether you're in person or online. So I'm glad of the chance to speak to you this afternoon. So this is a chance I've had to revisit a paper which I did start working on before the pandemic, around the time when we were initially talking about this visit. So the timing's actually worked out quite well to be working on what I was hoping to work on originally still, even if there's been a bit of an interval in between. So I'll share my kind of current work in progress and glad of the opportunity to discuss with you afterwards. And up front, I also want to take the opportunity to thank and acknowledge the people who I've been working with in Belize on this project. So this has been a project that has relied on the involvement, the facilitation of a number of organizations, people, communities in Belize as well. So I'm very grateful to them for making this happen. So this project comes out of a broader project about community-based water resources management interventions. And I've been working, as Chandana hinted, across environmental anthropology, anthropology of development, also STS, to think about the politics of knowledge in projects that are underpinned often by global frameworks for resource management, whether that's for things like the provision of drinking water or for biodiversity conservation, also often involving tourism and other kinds of purposes and activities. And so I've been thinking about how data, especially how scientific models and standards are brought to bear in these projects, and how multiple ways of knowing and acting in relation with the environment are negotiated. So thinking about, in this context, drinking water supply systems is one point of connection with some work I've been doing previously on infrastructures that involved highways predominantly. And then, as I'll outline today, I've also been drawing on some of the kind of burgeoning critical social science of logistics as a way to think through some of the puzzles of coordination that the residents, the scientists, government officials and community groups in watershed management programs, in this case in rural southern Belize, are grappling with. This is an area where I've been carrying out research since 2006. This particular project, fieldwork was 2017 to 18. So community watershed projects can take many different forms. In general, though, I'm talking about an approach to resource management that's based on a particular river basin, so not just the water, but the entire terrain of that catchment area, and also projects here which in some way involve local residents in decision-making about water and management. So just a bit of scene setting or orientation. In the villages that border the Billy-Barkadir National Park in the Stan Creek Valley of Belize's citrus belt, the residents frequently drew direct links between the health of the forest and the health of their bodies. In the 1970s, they had stopped using the creeks that were kind of at valley bottom level within the villages for drinking and for other domestic uses, citing contamination from the citrus industry, saying that this had made their skin itch after bathing. This is very much the hub of the citrus industry in the country. And so instead of using those creeks, they established modest gravity-fed pipe systems to convey surface water from a site up in the hills, which is now part of the national park. So the infrastructure that conveys the water is officially overseen by village water boards, who charge a small fee for maintenance, importantly not for the water itself, categorize it. That water doesn't undergo treatment at present, though some people may boil or chlorinate it at home. And nearly everyone that I met in these communities described this as their preferred drinking source, describing it as fresh, healthy, and clean, except maybe after rain. And rumours that were circulating that the government might impose a new treatment system were greeted with a fair degree of suspicion at the time, partly on terms of affordability, but also framed as a distaste both for chlorine treatment and also loss of local autonomy over that particular system. And several anthropologists, including Veronica Strang, have explored how perceptions of water quality can be connected to social relations with the people who manage water. So here, this kind of coupling of taste and trust that was combining in residents' narratives seemed to reveal something important about the political dynamics of the valley. For example, a common lack of faith in the government's commitment to protecting the interests of valley dwellers, reflecting, among other things, historical clashes over logging in and near the park, and also contemporary comparisons where people were looking to other towns and communities where there had been problems with reservoir contamination. So these debates were a way into exploring the local politics of knowledge, resources, and environmental relations. And as I mentioned, this was 2017 to 18. I spent 3 months living in the valley, following the work of a community-based organisation, a CBO, that had been tasked with co-managing this forested protected area, including the water source. And coming back to the kind of conceptual framing, if logistics, conventionally defined as a practical science of circulation, provision of services by moving things, people, or ideas, many such operations seem to be relevant here. Piping water, monitoring its quality, harnessing ecosystem benefits, generating tourist income, and mobilizing funding from various sources. This project is also about interfaces among infrastructures, from pipes, pumps, basins, and soils, to regulatory frameworks, funding networks, and political ways and means. Thinking through the movement of water, money, and data, I'm interested in sites and moments when logistics as a dream of efficient, uninterrupted flows meets logistics as an everyday craft, the resulting sense-making practices and mediations of time and space, nature, and infrastructure. And I'll suggest that these are emerging here, at least in part, from attempts to navigate the contradictory aims of the global paradigm of integrated water resources management, which I'll say a bit more about soon. And that these efforts involve effective engagement by those tasked with maintaining human and non-human life in this area. So a few things that I'll hopefully be able to cover in this talk. One is to examine this water and this watershed initiative as a crucial way that people in this area encounter the state and also other entities, and to consider such encounters in light of an environmental citizenship that has political, economic, and affective dimensions. Two is to bring this into conversation with the concept of logistics that illuminates the craft and labour that goes into moving water and other things through this rural supply system, and to discuss how that rubs up against the logistical ideals of efficiency embedded in integrated water resources management. And 3 is to bring this together to kind of frame this watershed logistics as a meeting place for infrastructural affordances and intimate human environment encounters. So this includes affective efforts of anticipation and mediation, especially for those who are positioned as brokers across different communities of practice. So Belize is a country of around 400,000 people. It's located on the Caribbean coast of Central America, and it's known for its ecological and cultural diversity. Its ties with Caribbean and American regions speak not only to its geographical location, but also its history of colonization by Britain when extractive industries of logging and plantation agriculture, including the citrus farms, were established. Its contemporary economy is underpinned still by agricultural exports, increasingly also by tourism. It's very much heralded as a centre for ecotourism, and around 38% of the terrestrial area is currently under some form of protective management. This is a map of various different kinds of protected areas. This includes extractive reserves as well as kind of nature reserves and other kinds of parks. And so among these protected areas is the small national park that I mentioned at the beginning. It's about 6.5 square kilometres. It's located in a rural area and an area where many of the neighbouring residents face a number of livelihood challenges associated with the decline in the citrus industry. Many of those large plantations that were established in the colonial period have fragmented, and the crops also been suffering greening disease. The residents of these villages are mainly Creole and Mestizo, and while many of them used to work in various branches of the citrus industry, many of them now make a living from casual work in construction, in aquaculture, tourism. Some do grow their own citrus, and some run small businesses or have public sector jobs. So I think it's too small to quite point out. I've got another map in a moment of where the actual the national park is, but we're looking around this area here. And it's one of these smaller parks here. That's about where it is. So the park generally encompasses a sub-watershed of the North Stann Creek River Basin, coming back to that catchment description. And so this is the catchment area of the Billy-Barkydale Creek. It's forested and steep, it features a waterfall, and it's bordered by 3 villages along the main valley road, which is one of 4 major highways in the country. And like 11 other Belizean protected areas, the national park is jointly run. So in this case, it's via a co-management agreement between the Forest Department, the government, and the community-based organisation, CBO, which is called the Steadfast Tourism and Conservation Association, or STACA. For decades, this creek has been the main source of water for the neighbouring communities. As I said, they've supplemented it with modest pipes and dams, and as such, the residents' efforts to provide resources are undertaken at the interface of built infrastructure and what we might think of, following Nelson and Bigger, as infrastructural nature, whereby environmental affordances, things like gravity, topography, the presence of springs, and are brought together with modest engineering interventions, layered and organised to supply drinking water. And these efforts to provision water are now being mobilised against the backdrop of national laws and policies, or series of these, addressing climate change, protected areas, and water management. And so STACA, the community organisation, and the Forest Department, along with other stakeholders, including other residents of the buffer communities, government representatives, scientists from the National University, are now discussing what these policies mean in practice for the co-management and also for the future sustainability of the park. So as such, this is a site where often antagonistic projects for present and future come together, securing drinking water, protecting biodiversity, negotiating resource extraction, and catering to tourist preferences. And the last one of the things on that list was also coordinating environmental citizenship claims, which is the next section. So entitling the talk Watershed Citizenship, I'm mindful of Jean Lazar's point that simply adding a qualifier to citizenship might suggest that it has a stable definition that can be nuanced with a prefix. That's not what I'm intending here. I'm interested instead about how ideas about what citizenship means and entails are constituted through human environment encounters here, especially how they're mobilized around the policy relevant unit of the watershed, or in this case, the sub-watershed. And so, as such, this definition of environmental citizenship departs from some that are grounded in environmental law or advocacy that might refer normatively to positive actions towards the environment. So instead, it's kind of taking a critical angle, reflecting on the situatedness of categories like individuals, institutions, what it means to undertake positive action towards the environment. Ben Orlov and colleagues have defined environmental citizenship as the position of individuals within political collectivities that are constituted in part through their connections to territories with specific environmental characteristics. And those might include topography, climate, various kinds of resources and hazards. And they pitch environmental citizens as the individuals within those collectives who address the opportunities and risks and seek to obtain significant and valuable knowledge about the territories. So starting here raises the question, what does it mean and entail for individuals and groups to seek to gather knowledge about environmental quality and risk, and how they mobilize this in the context of this integrated water resources management project. So thinking about integrated water resources management and how it aligns with these questions around logistics. Recent studies in social and political theory have drawn attention to logistics as a practical science and an imperative of circulation with often violent effects, rooted in the operations of war and the Atlantic slave trade, and reorganizing space via calculative rationalities. And I'm thinking here particularly of work by Deb Cowan, by Hani Moten and Charmaine Shaw. So critical attention to logistics from this angle thus raises questions about flows of capital and goods, and the efforts, intentions, and logics that underpin, but also may potentially undermine them, about what happens between the ideological and the material. It emphasizes the impact of coordination, whilst also testifying to fragility and contradiction, highlighting the supply chain, the algorithm and the grid, but also the choke point, blockade, and the leak. Taking a slightly different angle, Jane Guyer's anthropological conceptualization of logistics also addresses the sense of contingency, but attending to the life experience of living within and trying to make sense of assemblages largely created by others. That's a quotation from her 2016 book. So what happens when an arguably neoliberal logistics of resource management, this paradigm of integrated resources management, comes into contact with other ways of navigating human-environment relations? How do people try to translate in between economic, ecological, and political systems that may seem to be incommensurable? So in Belize, as in many other countries, this influential paradigm of IWRM has been introduced as a framework for water-related policies. It's defined by the Global Water Partnership as a process which promotes the coordinated development and management of water, land, and related resources in order to maximize the resultant economic and social welfare in an equitable manner without compromising the sustainability of vital ecosystems. So it seems to seek to do everything all at once. Promoted especially since the 1990s by transnational institutions such as the American Development Bank and at times the World Bank as well, it's pitched as a turn away from water management via large concrete infrastructures and top-down state management towards a more decentralized model of governance at catchment level, with principles espousing scientific expertise, stakeholder participation, and the idea of water as an economic good. And as such, it can be seen to embody a calculative science of circulation based on decentralized coordination of supply and demand. Although it's often translated into policy and enacted by national governments, its ideals project a more logistical imaginary echoing Swingadai's government beyond the state, enacted ideally via enrolment of civil society in the private sector. So as Lila Mehta and colleagues note for IWRM in Southern Africa, this has gone hand in hand with structural adjustment and a turn to the market. So in light of the potential and actual contradictions among the IWRM's goals of economic efficiency, environmental sustainability, and social equity, the argument for maximum value extraction often seems to win out. Perhaps not surprisingly for those familiar with critical accounts of participatory development initiatives, IWRM has been criticised for depoliticising resource management, for re-centralising power by privileging expert authority over situated knowledge, and by focusing on management processes of the resource at the expense of accounting for inequality in distribution. But despite such frictions, or perhaps because of some of these antagonisms, IWRM's appeal persists as both a planning and a market model. It's been identified by some water scientists as a nirvana concept, an idea with an almost impossible to deny moral imperative, but which contains many antagonistic elements beneath the language of optimization and integration. So as I mentioned, these policies have been adopted widely, especially by governments in Latin America. Belize enacted its National Integrated Water Resources Act in 2011. And at the time of my research, several years later, while the implementation was incomplete, some elements were being mobilized in early attempts to institutionalize particularly water assessment, so scientific assessments of water quantity, also licensing and pricing. So the IWRM framing encourages and enables exploration of water as an economic good, channeling attention and resources towards data collection and consultancy. And in doing so in Belize, it inspired public debate about the responsibilities of the state, the private sector, NGOs, donors, and publics in compiling and acting on this environmental knowledge that was coming out of the assessments. So just a couple more kind of definitional paragraphs. So thinking about watersheds and what this unit of analysis is. So this is the primary unit of analysis and intervention for IWRM is the watershed, a topographically determined catchment area drained by a river system or other water body and separated from its neighbour by a ridge. Anthropologists, including Ashley Cass, have explored how this apparently a priori natural category, often represented on maps as a series of kind of neatly interlocking jigsaw pieces, which are actually perhaps more like nested layers and which don't stop at national borders, unlike this representation on the left here. This apparently natural category is actually brought into being through a diverse and contested set of knowledge practices, which are capable of reflecting a range of ideologies about their social relevance. And in Ashley Cass's study of the Panama Canal, he's argued that watersheds conventionally categorized as nature can actually become infrastructure when they're enrolled as providers of critical services for human communities and economies. For example, delivering water to ensure the functioning of the Panama Canal. And this involves reorganization of populations and landscapes, whereby authorities can determine acceptable land use as that which directs water towards the operational needs of the shipping canal, and in this case at the expense of local agricultural practices. Elsewhere, in an urban setting, power dynamics and topography are also central to Nikhil Anand's conception of hydraulic citizenship. In this case in Mumbai, where the politics of belonging can depend on both physical and political pressure, convolution of gravity with pipes, pumps, and also people's ways and means of arranging access and maintenance. So while my ethnographic example focuses on a much more modest scale, there's no mega project or urban sprawl here. The socio-technical components of the water system are nonetheless bound up with the infrastructural politics of water knowledge, resource making, and distribution. Springs, aquifers, soil, creeks, and waterfalls are supplemented with channels, pipes, tanks, roads, and cables. And together they enable or constrain the movement of water. They leak, they must be repaired. And there are also less tangible infrastructures at work, maps and databases that describe and anticipate resources, governance regimes and expert networks that authorize or preclude certain decisions and practices. So Nelson and Bigger's definition of infrastructural natures is the outcome of strategies that make ecosystems legible, governable, and investable as systems of critical functions that sustain and secure certain forms of human life, draws attention to where use value for humans is realized, and makes us ask for whom. So for this particular sub-watershed, the supply of potable water to meet biophysical needs tends to headline community discussions. But use value is also invoked in relation to protecting biodiversity and other ecosystem services, which are intended, planned, anticipated to generate rents via tourism and research. These can be listed as scenic beauty, natural wealth, recreation, and non-timber forest products, among other things that are included in these plans. But these are not the only values that people in the villages associated with the watershed. And just as one example, residents repeatedly highlighted the distinct qualities of the water, the taste, suggesting a sensory politics that values not only potability, but palatability, as Christy Spackman has written about. This contributes to a sense of place, a sense of home, and politics of autonomy. And in terms of shifting this across to the next part of the kind of subtitle of my talk, Nelson and Bigger also note that nature in and of itself is not infrastructure, but it takes work to make it that way. As Ashley Cast would have said, it needs to be enrolled into these bigger kinds of systems of economic circulation and provision of critical services. But water can be unruly. It's difficult, if not impossible, to capture and calculate. And whilst most attention in this project falls on surface water, not all water is that visible. Groundwater, as Andrea Ballestero notes, is particularly elusive. And this is evident in this case study in Belize's karst geology, where proliferation of subterranean cave systems, aquifers, sinkholes, and other peculiar rock formations complicate the predictability of water behavior. So while some riverine connections can certainly forge social, economic, and political relations in terms of linking people along bodies of water, watershed borders don't always or rarely align with other kinds of political and territorial organization. So the rest of the talk is looking at some of the efforts that people put into trying to make the watershed into infrastructure, trying to make sense of these different borders and boundaries. So the valley is a topographical feature. It's formed by the North Stand Creek River. Its villages are connected by the Valley Road, also by a common landscape history based on citrus production, and a sense of place upheld by things like civic activities, as well as by the shared water sources in the surrounding hills. For the village residents, these water sources served as a crucial and effective point of reference for place and home, grounds for hope amid the economic hardship and uncertainty of the declining citrus industry. And as discussed above, the watershed as a spatial unit of analysis and intervention in the IWRM processes also bumps up against these other kinds of boundaries and designations of difference. So it involves people kind of engaging with these questions of coordination at the margins, how to make sense of the edges, breaches, and overlaps involved in efforts towards watershed management. So when the national park, the Big Arcadia National Park, was declared a protected area in 2001, one of its main purposes was to conserve that elevated water source up in the hills, the catchment area of which being a sub-watershed of the North Stand Creek Basin. But as became clear in a meeting of the community-based organisation where maps of the park and the water sources were being displayed and discussed, it became clear that the national park borders didn't really match up with the hydrogeological map. The borders had been surveyed as straight lines, and at least one spring that had been recognised to feed into that creek was seen to be lying outside that park boundary, so effectively confounding the park manager's efforts to protect the water resources by regulating land use and activities feeding into that source. So questions were then raised about logging activity taking place near to that external spring, which would have an impact on the park's effectiveness, but lay outside its jurisdiction. And this joins several challenges raised against the spatial representation of watersheds as neatly interlocking, including other debates about how contaminants might leach through soils, and, as mentioned, the subterranean geology. Evapotranspiration and human transportation of water and waste can also exceed the presumed boundaries of watersheds, troubling them as units of analysis. So these challenges compelled questions not only about where the edges of the park seem to be located, but also what it was that the park was there to do and whether it was able to fulfill its ends. So the park's been co-managed since 2004, 3 years after its establishment. And the members of the community organisation of STACA do most of the practical work that's associated with this. They're the ones applying for grants, they're patrolling the forest, organising scientific research, and managing the tourism. So STACA nominally works with government, but that said, having been formed in 1994 after a scientific study warned that deforestation was threatening the water supply, the group has historically also clashed with the government, for example, over logging concessions a few years back, using their position to try and make claims on the government to protect the area. So such tensions about responsibilities for the park and the water system are key ways that citizens here encounter the state and other institutions, both working with them and also having these sometimes antagonistic relations. The STACA board members, the community organisation board members, are unpaid, and many grants that they have access to won't cover rangers' salaries or routine maintenance that's necessary for the day-to-day functioning of the park. It's much more project-focused. So the CBOs increasingly are being encouraged to fundraise through tourism, but there are regulatory limits on how this can be done. There are practical challenges in balancing visitor activities with environmental protection. And also, as was raised here, political questions about depending on tourist whims and fashions in order to fund essential services such as drinking water. In terms of thinking locally about how the labour was distributed or how activities were shared out, compensated, credited, I heard arguments from the community residents that they and their neighbours should be contributing to this work for the love of the environment or for community or for country. But also some noted that as people with precarious livelihoods, they shouldn't be expected to give their time for free. And there's just a few examples of some of the comments that kind of came out around these debates up on the slide. I can have a read. So when people are arguing for contributing this work on the basis of love and doing this for ostensibly for free, this can be read through a lens of environmentality, where a conservation project creates environmentalist subjects through enrolling them in certain practices, and also through broader nationalist discourses, which at once serves the tourism sector by promoting Belize's forests and reefs to visitors and projects a popular sense of distinction from neighbouring countries in what can be a tense diplomatic context. An alternative argument being made here by other comments articulates a claim for proper payment, comparable to those that Michael Sepek recorded among the COFAN in Ecuador, who recognised their contributions to a collaborative museum project as alienated labour. And I also counted emotional and affective expressions of situated belonging and long-standing care. This was in some of the comments on the previous slide as well, suggesting a complex picture whereby, as Neera Singh suggests in Odisha, political and economic rationalities for environmentalist activities are also bound up with structures of feeling, memory, intellect, and ethics. So that was talking about responsibilities relating to the national park management particularly. And responsibilities for water, more broadly speaking, are also quite distributed. So STACA protects the source by patrolling, clearing litter, and other activities to ensure that the creek within the park avoids contamination. This is not funded by the water rates. This is part of the national park activities. There are also 3 different village water boards who are tasked with maintaining pipes that deliver water to references. That is part of the water rates arrangements. Government health inspectors test for potability, and the Department for Environment tests for pollution. The universities provide scientific advice. So there are many different people contributing to these various activities. And on paper, some of those are quite clearly assigned, but in practice, not very clear-cut. So water, people, and instruments do not behave as expected. Monitoring is risky for rangers and scientists trekking into the park's interior. Humidity interferes with sensors and batteries. Payments are withheld. And infrastructural things like pipes and institutional things like parks and villages rarely align with the mapped watersheds, as we've already seen. So the local logistical and effective labours of making the park and the water systems work to provide water and other services are thus operating against multiple and partial ecological and political categories. For example, the watershed and the sub-watershed, and management arrangement and these kind of co-management distributions. And in order to make these work, there must be some kind of momentary alignment at least. So here, I suggest that another facet of thinking with logistics as well as infrastructure is the attention that this draws to temporal coordination. And just as an example here, I want to zoom in on a few among the proliferating series of management plans which were at issue in the meetings and the expeditions that I joined during the fieldwork. Observing these meetings and talking with the STACA members responsible for organising the plans and the relations that they represented with other institutions, with nature, with a range of alternative futures, it was evident that the members of the organisation were engaged not only in a great deal of the physical labour of infrastructure maintenance, repair and monitoring as part of the day-to-day work of provisioning water and looking after the park, but also making huge diplomatic, bureaucratic and monitoring and effective efforts to navigate how different potential futures of the watershed and its communities may or may not come to pass. And of several planning documents under discussion, 4 stood out to me, and I'll quickly summarise a few of those 4. So the first, which was the only one that had been completed at the time of research, was a 5-year management plan to preserve the natural and scenic values of the national park. So this was the National Park Management Plan. This prioritises the biological heritage of the area, with particular reference to vulnerable and endangered species, such as the Baird's tapir, which is Belize's national animal, a focus on kind of charismatic fauna, and also its services pertaining to water, resources, and local economic development. It includes spatial zoning for different uses, from recreation closer to the villages up to strict conservation zones, and suggests scientific activities as a way to discourage illicit incursions by laying claim to that space as a space for science rather than anything else. It also includes recommendations for training, watershed protection and farming practices, and for monitoring and evaluation of its effectiveness and its conservation success. It also raises, although it doesn't answer, the thorny issue of who pays and who is paid for water source protection, as well as maintenance of engineered infrastructure. And as well as this kind of 5-year plan horizon, it also includes long-time hypotheses given climate change over 50 to 100 years. We've come forward ahead in the slides already for the second one, which was to note that discussions were also underway towards a water monitoring plan, so a specific focus on water quality. During these meetings, technical debates about how to measure quantity, quality, and flow also always reference the purpose of that monitoring and the possible futures that it could enable. And there were different versions of this available. So would testing only be done at that original source of the creek where the water was being extracted? Would it be done at other points inside the park as well? How about the sites further downstream from the villages, way beyond the borders of the park, but in the wider Stone Creek watershed? Perhaps at people's domestic taps. And should that data, when it was collected, be measured against the US Environmental Protection Agency standards, which was routine for the university scientists working with natural resources management, when it might look quite different against the WHO standards that the public health inspectors were using? Each decision, therefore, reflected a different goal. So some of these programs or pathways towards water monitoring could help to confirm potability for drinking water specifically. Others could be part of evidencing the environmental protection successes or otherwise of the park, perhaps pinpointing contamination in order to act on particular activities, maybe checking ambient safety for the tourist activities, or assuring industrial compliance for local businesses. So a huge range of different ways that this could be done with different outcomes. So while some of the STACA members emphasised identifying current contamination hotspots within the park so that they could take immediate protective action, others proposed it would be better to expand this downstream, using the protected source as a baseline. And this could either, or this could have multiple motivations. It could help to justify the park by comparing it to non-protected areas. But there was also the potential here to support environmental justice claims that were being voiced by downstream communities concerned about industrial contamination. And while the latter seemed quite desirable and was quite motivating for many in the community, it wasn't necessarily possible for the community-based organisation to undertake that work within the remit of its co-management agreement. The third plan up for discussion was a strategic or business plan for the national park. This was being discussed by STACA in a US university. And volunteers from the university's business school have been advising on training in bookkeeping for the community team, but also making suggestions for how to monetize the park as soon as possible and feed into the plan for financial sustainability, for example, by developing new lucrative tourist initiatives. There was no shortage of ideas put forward for this, but there were frequent frictions relating to the activities that the park was able to operate within the rules of the national system of protected areas, and even more explicitly, the question of how to increase tourism and possibly scientific tourism, research activity, while also complying with the long-term conservation imperatives. And finally, and kind of linked with the water monitoring plan that I mentioned, there was also talk of expanding the entire management plan to cover the whole of the North Stone Creek watershed, which at the time was very much a kind of ideal long-term view, something that would not be easy, perhaps not possible, at least not without much wider buy-in beyond the national park. So this ambition, voiced by members of the community, reflected an understanding of the shared conditions of inhabiting the same watershed and the ability to bring these visions and experiences together to make various kinds of claims. But it was also recognised that these kind of borders of the park, the remits of the organisations, the different resources that were available, were kind of fragmenting that potential for watershed solidarity at that stage. And so there's all those plans had various kinds of measures and benchmarks embedded in them. all of them involved in establishing, approving, and monitoring these plans. These represent not only the potential for data as evidence to support the continued existence of the national park, to make that case for effectiveness or for necessity to funders and to the government, they also offer proof, evidence of the community's commitment and buy-in to these forms of scientific management and sustainable financing of the kind promoted in the IWRM monitoring programs and conservation initiatives. And different environmental, social, and financial futures are conjured through the work of these plans to bring unruly social and ecological worlds into alignment, and to enroll networks of expert authority in different places, whether this is Belizean consultants, biologists from Mexico, business school students from the US. And while I was mainly a silent observer during the meetings about these plans, I recognized that my own research as an anthropologist and my presence in those meetings is also part of those relationships as well. So this created a kind of a whole series of plans that are quite powerful and also cross-referential, explicitly seeking to integrate each other into their rhythms and visions. So, for example, the National Park Management Plan includes conservation targets and limits to acceptable change, which all future bids and plans must also work towards. And as Laura Ogden argues for the Everglades, this bureaucratization of ecosystems makes the knowledge of these kinds of institutional relationships, how those processes work, vital for those who are seeking to be part of decisions affecting the areas they live in. And I felt that the Stacker grant writers' efforts with those multiple timelines, managing these different rhythms and zones, recalls Laura Baer's recognition of the strenuous mediations of managing modern social time. It was very clear from this that it takes work, skill, and care to anticipate and to navigate these asynchronic rhythms of human and non-human time, to wrangle them into temporary alignment as a form of sense-making and potentially world-building. So these are multiple multi-year plans, also relating to daily activities that have to shift with and against grant and budget cycles, elections, the visits of volunteers, consultancy contracts, seasonal weather, vegetation and tourism. And they shift from the immediate concerns of fixing leaking pipes and of apprehending trespassers to multi-decadal climate change horizons and the slow accumulations of toxicity in environments and bodies. So in this and many other ways, the kind of logistical dreams of efficient resource management are constantly challenged by these vagaries of natural infrastructure, of organic and anthropogenic contamination, of funding, of the limits of diplomacy, and of leaky infrastructures. The logics of IWRM is seeking efficiency via calculative optimization of water itself, and doing this through the outsourcing of a lot of this labor to community groups and to others who may well be experiencing economic precarity, while also being involved in this work of temporal mediation and also fundraising. Okay, so just to conclude, a bit of a summing up. Thinking about the logistics of watershed management means connecting the politics of planning, monitoring, and provision with environmental affordances, sense-making practices, and the effective anticipation of livable worlds. It means considering infrastructural futures not only in urban or capital-intensive contexts. This relatively small-scale rural water system nonetheless connects to ambivalent state encounters and to globally circulating paradigms. It means not only considering the instrumental provision and flow of water as a resource, but attending to how intimate and effective practices constitute socio-ecological relations. The intimacy of watershed logistics is particularly visible here, where human health is at stake as people take water into their bodies, and some activities are framed as very long-standing relations of environmental care. So in this context of idealized governance beyond the state, private bodies, NGOs, and even tourists are potentially shaping the provision of basic needs. but policy and regulation are still working through national governments. The territories and temporalities that emerge through these encounters trouble the boundaries of watersheds, protected areas, and other organisational fields, often highlighting leakage rather than the conventional logistical metaphor of flow. And these infrastructural and logistical roles of the terrain and the waterways here are not their only characteristics. It takes work to hold them in place. So this kind of anticipatory effort of logistics as situated craft that Jane Dyer talks about, I think is apparent in Stucker members' practical labours to make things work. Writing plans to mediate different rhythms, catching tourist attention, practicing care in concert with or in spite of topography, fluidity, equipment. It also involves navigating polarising debates with government, funders, and neighbours about how this work should be conducted and remunerated. So in this case, attention to political ecology means thinking about the making and unmaking of nature and infrastructure, and about the responsibilities that different people who are differently positioned have in knowledge negotiations about uncertain environmental futures. I shall leave it there.
Thank you. Thanks very much, Sophie. I think we're now open for